On the morning of June 6, 1944, at precisely 7:26 a.m., two P-47 Thunderbolts descended through the overcast skies above Normandy. Each aircraft was armed with 8 5-inch HVAR rockets, designed to penetrate 6 inches of reinforced steel. However, there was a significant issue. The rockets were launching erratically, veering off course and spiraling into the hedgerows, falling 50 or 60 yards short of their intended targets. Frustrated pilots voiced their anger over the radio, with one exclaiming that the rails were ineffective and the rockets were behaving like bricks. Another pilot mentioned needing 8 attempts to achieve a single hit. During the first month of the Normandy campaign, the Air Force documented a 61% failure rate for unguided rockets launched from low altitudes. At 7:29 a.m., a flight leader contacted the group commander reporting a column of German tanks moving swiftly through a tree line near St. Lo, with dust trailing behind the Panthers and Panzer IVs. Yet, the rockets remained unreliable. A sergeant on the ground, keeping track of the attack logs, jotted down a note in the margin: "Unstable rails again." This phrase appeared so frequently that month it almost became a running joke, though no one found it amusing. Each misfired rocket meant American infantry would soon confront tanks in open terrain. What none of the pilots circling above, nor the officers in command trucks, nor anyone else anticipated was that the entire issue, the frustrating unpredictability of the rockets, could be traced back to something so minuscule it seemed almost ridiculous. A misalignment averaging 1.8 degrees, just 2 millimeters, on metal spanning the length of a man's arm. A detail easily overlooked by most mechanics, drowned out by the chaos of war, and overshadowed by the urgency of getting aircraft airborne by 9 a.m. Yet 300 meters away, in a vast building at the Naval Aircraft Factory, illuminated by rows of fluorescent lights buzzing like insects, a 24-year-old inspection technician named Evelyn Carter was examining a single rocket rail bracket. She realized that the slight tilt she observed was not due to chance, coincidence, or wear. It was a consistent pattern. At 7:41 a.m., as rockets in Normandy continued to veer off course like erratic arrows, she ran her fingers along the underside of a rail, sensing a vibration she couldn't measure, noticing a faint crescent of carbon dust accumulating on one edge. She paused, hesitated, and looked again. That moment of hesitation, where she questioned her own observations, would become one of the quiet turning points of 1944. She was unaware of this at the time. She only understood that if the rail was even slightly crooked, by a degree or two, the rocket would twist upon leaving the wing. And if it twisted, it would tumble, and if it tumbled, it would miss. If it missed, someone on the ground would lose their life. She later whispered something that a coworker, standing 10 feet away, remembered. "A single degree can be fatal." That was at 7:43 a.m. 3 minutes later, Normandy documented another unsuccessful rocket strike. 8 attempts, no hits. The question that lingers now, the one I believe viewers should ponder, is this: do you think a misalignment smaller than a fingernail's width can change the outcome of a battle? If you agree that such minute details can determine wars, type the number 7 in the comments right now. If you believe this is exaggerated and that wars are influenced only by larger forces, then tap like. And if you're interested in more stories where the overlooked moments of history emerge in instances as fleeting as a breath, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Because this story is just beginning. By the summer of 1944, the American war effort was producing rockets at a pace unmatched by any Air Force in history, with over 1.2 million HVAR rounds manufactured, filled, and shipped within months. Yet accuracy was so unreliable that some field commanders quietly requested a return to traditional bombs. The HVAR was intended to solve a problem that had plagued pilots since the first strafing runs in North Africa: how to stop a tank without descending from 10,000 feet and hoping that gravity and luck were on your side. On paper, the calculations were impressive. A 5-inch rocket weighing about 100 pounds, launched from a Thunderbolt's wing at approximately 1,300 feet per second, capable of penetrating 6 inches of rolled homogeneous armor if it hit at the right angle. But the battlefield doesn't care about theoretical calculations. Reports from the 9th Air Force in early June described rockets landing 60 to 80 yards short, or veering sideways as if guided by invisible forces. At 8:10 a.m. on June 9th, a pilot from the 386th noted in his debrief that his rockets left the rails with a slight tilt, a tiny angle that threw the entire strike off. When I compare those debriefs with the Naval Aircraft Factory assembly logs, something stands out that most casual readers overlook. The rails were never identical, not once. Minor differences in weld temperature, jig alignment, and even the muscle memory of individual workers created a variance that technicians later measured between 0.4 and 2.6 degrees of misalignment. It seems minuscule, but when you extend that deviation across a rocket traveling over 1,000 feet in a second, you get a drift that can mean life or death. And here's the twist that captivates me. The engineers who designed the HVAR weren't the ones who discovered this variance. They were too removed from the noise, the metal, the repetitive grind that reveals patterns only when you handle the same thing for 12 hours a day. The individuals who frequently examined the rails and noticed any discrepancies were the inspection workers, predominantly women employed between 1942 and 1944 when the draft caused a shortage of male labor. During this period, over 300,000 women joined the aircraft industry, taking on tasks that others avoided. They sanded seams, measured clearances with weary eyes, and inspected welds in deafening buildings. According to surviving internal memos, they detected minor issues that engineers overlooked. By mid-June, the rocket rail problem had escalated into a strategic concern. German tanks were navigating through hedgerows more swiftly than Allied planners had anticipated. Panthers and Panzer IVs, particularly the late war models with reinforced front armor, were deflecting glancing blows from small arms and even some anti-tank guns. The rocket's functionality was crucial, not optional. Every hour without a dependable tank-busting weapon increased Allied casualty estimates by hundreds. This isn't conjecture. War Department planning documents from June 15th explicitly mention a projected rise of over 5,000 infantry casualties in the next 30 days if rocket performance didn't improve. At this point, I must pause briefly because the scale of this industrial effort is astonishing. The United States could manufacture almost anything during those years. Bombers at Willow Run were completed every 63 minutes. Tanks in Detroit were produced so rapidly they seemed to multiply like steel creatures. But the price of this speed was uniformity. Assembly lines introduce minor errors, much like a long march causes blisters. It's inevitable. And unless someone at the final step notices the blister forming, the entire system falters. From the documents I've reviewed and the interviews that remain, it's evident that the officers on the ground in Normandy were unaware of why the rockets were failing. Pilots blamed the ammunition, the sights, or even the air itself, as if the winds of Normandy held a personal vendetta. No one suspected the rails. In hindsight, and this is my personal interpretation of the records, the story isn't really about rockets or rails, it's about specialization. The experts in airflow and ballistics were too removed from the production line to see that a worker, using a worn jig, could create a 1 millimeter inconsistency, and that 1 millimeter could result in a soldier's death 50 miles away. This is why I believe this moment is significant. It reveals the hidden framework of war, the way industrial flaws ripple outward until they reach the battlefield. If this resonates with you, if the notion that massive wars hinge on microscopic errors seems true, type the number 7 in the comments. If you believe this is exaggerated and that wars are influenced only by larger forces, then tap like. And if you're interested in more stories where the overlooked moments of history emerge in instances as fleeting as a breath, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Because this story is just beginning. Evelyn Carter's shift started at 6:03 a.m., but she usually arrived before 5:40 because the inspection bay was more peaceful before the air tools began to rattle the catwalks. At 24, she was a former bookkeeper from Camden who had mastered blueprint reading in under 6 weeks.
By the summer of 1944, she could feel the curve of a rocket rail bracket with her fingertips, much like a violinist senses the texture of a bow.
The Naval Aircraft Factory in Philadelphia employed over 10,000 workers, nearly half of whom were women, and the heat from the weld shafts was so intense that inspectors sometimes found their pencils softened to wax by midday. Evelyn appreciated the quiet before the machines roared to life. It allowed her a moment to think, though thinking was a rare luxury in a facility designed to move metal forward without delay. On June 21st at 6:19 a.m., she picked up a newly machined rail, officially labeled Assembly 9427 Delta, and felt a slight shift under her thumb, as if the metal was twisted 1 degree off its axis. She couldn't measure it with her fingers, no one could, but she sensed it. She scraped off a bit of carbon dust with her nail and noticed a crescent-shaped smear was thicker on the left side, a pattern she'd observed 7 or 8 times without fully realizing its significance. She set the rail down, picked up another, and saw the same faint crescent. A third rail showed the same thing, and she paused. It's curious how the mind detects a pattern long before acknowledging its meaning. At 6:23, she leaned over the bench, pulled the fixture gauge closer, and checked the alignment marks. They were within tolerance, perfect on paper. But the rails weren't perfect. She knew they weren't. Her heart raced as she slid the 4th rail into the jig. The indicator needle drifted half a degree to the left, then settled back. Such drift could result from temperature changes, vibrations, or a welder's arm growing tired after working through the night. Or it could stem from something systematic, something unnoticed because everyone was focused on numbers, not the tactile feel of metal. The official tolerance for rail alignment was plus or minus 2 degrees, but a rocket launched from the wing of a P-47 diving at 360 miles per hour doesn't care about blueprint allowances. A misalignment of 1.8 degrees, or 0.8 of a degree, as she would later discover, results in a drift exceeding 50 yards over a distance of 1,000 yards. This 50-yard difference could mean the distinction between striking a Panther's engine deck or merely hitting the ground. She exhaled slowly, lifted the rail once more, angled it against the overhead light, and noticed something that caught her off guard. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic, but there was a subtle variation in the weld bead itself. On parts manufactured after June 17th, the bead had a nearly imperceptible outward curve. No one on the production line would detect it. Welders adhered to jigs, inspectors checked tolerances, and supervisors focused on quotas. Yet amidst the noise, a pattern was emerging. She whispered to herself, "This is wrong." At 6:32 a.m., she brought the rails to her supervisor's desk. He barely glanced up. The plant was understaffed. The night shift had produced a record number of rails, and they were behind schedule. He assured her the tolerances were acceptable, the jigs were certified, and the calibration logs were current. If she slowed the line without a quantifiable defect, she risked being reprimanded. She stood there, holding the 4 rails, with the fluorescent lights buzzing above, questioning if she was imagining it all. Then she noticed the soot on her hands. The carbon dust typically gathered on the underside of the rails during test firings, but this time it formed a crescent on the same side of each rail. It wasn't random or coincidental, it was a sign of misalignment. The moment was significant, though she didn't know why. I've reviewed her personnel file and the shop logs from that day, and I believe she hesitated because she grasped a simple truth. Halting a production line during wartime is an act of bravery. No one praises you for slowing the war machine, but the consequences ripple downstream in ways inspectors often sense first. Her next step was a quiet act of defiance. She returned the rails to her bench and conducted an unofficial measurement using a machinist's straight edge a friend had lent her weeks earlier. The variance was 2 millimeters on one end, which translated to nearly a 1.8 degree deviation over the rail's length. At 6:43 a.m., she let out a small, defeated sigh, knowing it was significant yet insufficient to persuade the chain of command. She wiped the carbon dust onto a cloth, studied the crescent shapes, and realized she had inadvertently gathered physical evidence. She placed the cloth beside the rails, stepped back, and the pattern became clear. All 4 crescents leaned to the left. Each of the 4 welds bulged outward, and all 4 rails veered off their intended path.
If you've ever had that uncanny moment when scattered details suddenly make sense, or if you've ever experienced that jolt of recognition that no one else seems to notice, type the number 7 in the comments. But if you think this is an exaggeration, a mere coincidence, or a story reading too much into random noise, then like the video instead. However, if you're curious about what she did next, the choice that could have cost her job but ultimately changed the lethality of an entire class of rockets, stay tuned to the series, subscribe, and watch how one quiet discovery resonated all the way to the fields of France. She returned to the inspection bay after 7 a.m., with a decision forming faster than her fear of being wrong. The factory's calibration room opened at 7:05 a.m., a narrow corridor with concrete floors and racks of tools that smelled of oil and heat. She entered carrying all 4 rails and the cloth still marked with crescent-shaped soot. The technician on duty glanced at her but didn't stop her because, in wartime, almost no one interrupts anything that resembles work. She placed the first rail into the precision jig, a hardened steel cradle with alignment pins machined to tolerances so tight you could feel temperature changes through your fingertips. She lowered the locking arm, checked the dial indicator, and there it was, a drift of 1.7 to 1.9 degrees to the left. She paused for a moment, then checked again. Same result. Checked once more. Same. In testing, consistency is revelation, randomness is noise. She moved to the second rail, 1.8. Third rail, almost identical drift. By that date, the factory had produced over 40,000 rails. But if even a small fraction had this defect, the issue would spread from the workbench to the battlefield like a crack in a dam. And this is where the story takes a sharp turn, because she did something almost no inspector dared to do. She recorded numbers outside the official log. 7:10 a.m., Rail 1, 1.8, Rail 2, 1.9, Rail 3, 1.8, Rail 4, 1.8. The numbers were small, but the consequences expanded rapidly if you calculated the geometry. A rocket leaving an aircraft at 360 miles per hour with a thrust line misaligned by 1.8 degrees would drift over 150 feet at 1,000 yards. I remember looking at that calculation in the post-war test reports and thinking, it's astonishing how much death hides in a fraction of a degree. At 7:16 a.m., she transported the rails to the ballistic simulation setup, a basic yet effective apparatus where technicians used high-pressure air bursts to simulate rocket launches. The factory's prototype rail jig propelled a dummy rocket towards a sand butt located 80 feet away. Although she lacked the authority to operate the rig, authority often depends on whether anyone questions it. She inserted the modified rail, positioned the dummy rocket, stepped back, and fired. The rocket's nose hit the left side of the butt precisely where her calculations had indicated. She fired again, and the deviation was identical. By the 5th attempt, she felt a tightness in her throat because she was certain this wasn't a one-time manufacturing flaw. It was systemic, reproducible, and therefore fixable. However, fixable doesn't equate to simple. The jigs used for welding the rails had been certified in April, deemed stable and reliable, and production had ramped up to meet the Normandy demand. Altering a jig during a production surge was nearly unthinkable because every minute of downtime meant fewer aircraft equipped for the front. But the evidence was clear in the sand butt. 5 impacts forming a neat diagonal cluster that practically screamed mechanical misalignment. At 7:23, she photographed the butt with a small factory camera, held the print next to the rail, and saw the story unfold in parallel lines. Later, when reviewing that frame in the archives, I was struck by how ordinary it appeared, 5 chalk marks in sand. And yet everything was encapsulated in that image, like witnessing the pivot between failure and function. She took the evidence to the floor chief, a man with a decade of naval work experience who had little patience for inspectors bringing him problems. Initially, he didn't look up. She placed the rails on his desk regardless. He sighed, then brushed the soot with his thumb, frowning as he noticed the same crescent she had observed. He lifted one rail, aligned it by eye against the fluorescent reflections, and squinted. A long 10 seconds passed. Then, very quietly, he said, "Measure again." His tone had shifted from dismissal to concern. She placed the rail in his office jig, 1.8 degrees. He exhaled through his teeth, a sound caught between annoyance and fear, because a flaw this small indicated something devastating The welding jigs themselves had drifted. Steel warps under heat and repetition. Thousands of weld cycles introduce tiny biases, and once a jig drifts, every subsequent part bears the mark. By 7:37 a.m., the chief had called for a halt on Line C. 41 workers froze mid-task, sparks still hanging in the air from weld arcs suddenly extinguished. Stopping a wartime line was like halting a locomotive with bare hands. But the numbers demanded it. They removed the jig. They conducted a comprehensive inspection, revealing a deviation of exactly 1.83 degrees. There was no disputing it. The geometry was clear. What stands out to me most when I revisit the documents is that the root cause wasn't a major failure, but a loose dowel pin affected by thermal expansion. This pin had shifted by less than 2 millimeters, just enough to change the effectiveness of an entire class of weapons. The corrective measures were initiated almost immediately. Adjust the rail mounts by 0.88 millimeters, realign the jig to within 0.25 degrees, and add an extra verification step at the end of the welding process.
11 tanks destroyed, 7 damaged, 14 soft vehicles obliterated. And here is where the numbers gain momentum. Between July 4th and August 13th, American rocket-equipped fighter bombers accounted for 112 confirmed tank or self-propelled gun kills in the Normandy theater alone. That total stunned analysts because the rockets had been considered unreliable only weeks earlier. The only major variable that changed was rail alignment. To understand how decisive this was, look at the German reactions during the same period. During the Falaise pocket in mid-August, German armored units reported that movement in daylight had become untenable due to aerial rockets that struck with excessive precision. The phrase appears in at least 3 surviving German field diaries. Panzer crews began abandoning vehicles at the first sign of a fighter-bomber approach. They discovered that once a P-47 committed to an attack, the rockets no longer strayed. They struck, they penetrated, they destroyed. However, the effects on the battlefield are just one aspect of the story. The strategic impact is subtler, yet more profound. Consider this. Every tank eliminated before reaching the front lines spared American infantry from facing it in the hedgerows, where a single Panther could hold up a battalion. Every disabled half-track delayed German counterattacks that might have closed gaps in the Allied advance towards St. Lo. From my analysis of the campaign reports, it is evident that the Allies gained not only from firepower, but also from something almost philosophical, a renewed sense of confidence. For the first time, pilots had faith in their rockets. At 6:34 p.m. on August 2nd, a pilot from the 405th Fighter Group noted in his log, "Rockets go where I tell them, feels like magic." It wasn't magic. It was 2 millimeters shaved from error, restored to alignment, transformed into destruction, far from the woman who first sensed that drift under her thumb. I sometimes wonder if Evelyn ever saw the combat footage her recalibrated rails enabled. There is no evidence she did. The factory continued its work, the war kept consuming metal. Yet the connection is clear, from her bench in Philadelphia to the burning wrecks on the roads of France. If you think this link between a minor industrial adjustment and a battlefield transformation makes sense, type 7 in the comments. If you believe I'm exaggerating the precision, that war is too chaotic for one adjustment to matter, like the video instead. And if you want to see how this change influenced the broader Allied strategy, subscribe, because the next chapter goes beyond rockets into the industrial logic that won the war. By the end of August 1944, the American command structure began to understand something the pilots had realized weeks earlier. The corrected rail racks were not just enhancing accuracy, they were changing the operational pace of the entire Western Front. The 9th Air Force compiled its monthly summary at 8:03 a.m. on September 1st, reporting that rocket-equipped fighter bombers had increased armored vehicle destruction by more than 200% compared to June. The numbers seemed unbelievable until analysts traced the timing backward and saw that the surge began almost exactly when the recalibrated rail shipments reached forward airfields. This is where the story expands. A tiny industrial correction leading to a tactical improvement that then cascades into a strategic shift.
German units were the first to experience this. Panzerlehr, once a leading armored force in Europe, noted that moving during the day had become a death wish due to the highly accurate Allied rocket attacks. This observation is found in a surviving piece of a regimental diary dated August 27th. By early September, German military manuals were being distributed along the Western Front, advising tank commanders to operate only at dawn or dusk and to completely avoid open roads when American fighter bombers were present. This change cut their mobility by almost half, a seemingly minor effect until you consider it in the context of the larger Allied advance across France. Tanks unable to move in daylight couldn't reinforce failing lines, launch effective counterattacks, or retreat swiftly enough to escape encirclement. Essentially, the rockets did more than destroy tanks. They paralyzed military strategy. At 9:32 a.m. on September 12th, Allied intelligence officers observed a new trend. German armored units began breaking into smaller groups of 3 or 4 vehicles instead of moving in larger platoons. The strategy was straightforward: make it more difficult for American aircraft to target large convoys. However, this dispersion led to new issues. Smaller groups lacked the firepower to withstand Allied ground forces and were often isolated and destroyed piecemeal. I have come across 9 different reports of German tanks left intact in forest clearings because their crews feared any open movement would be targeted by rockets. In 6 of these reports, investigators specifically noted that the blast patterns and penetration angles were consistent with the 5-inch HVAR, validating the crew's fears. What intrigues me, and this is my personal interpretation of the archival data, is how swiftly the psychological impact surpassed the physical one. In warfare, perception often outpaces reality. Once German units believed that Allied rockets were infallible, they behaved as if it were true. By mid-September, the German 7th Army circulated a warning that American rockets were exhibiting an unprecedented level of accuracy. This statement was notable because the Germans, who had excellent intelligence on American weaponry, were aware that the HVAR had previously been unreliable. Their acknowledgement of its accuracy indicated the battlefield experiences had repeatedly confirmed this. Concurrently, the Americans began incorporating the improved rocket system into their operational strategies. Tactical planners at the 9th Air Force revised their attack recommendations for P-47 squadrons, reducing dive angles from 40 degrees to 30 degrees since the rockets no longer needed steep trajectories for stabilization. This minor doctrinal adjustment allowed pilots to execute more attack runs per sortie and minimize their exposure to light flak. The outcome was a measurable increase in sorties, extended engagement windows, and enhanced pilot survival. In the latter half of August, P-47 losses to ground fire on rocket missions decreased by nearly 20% compared to June and early July. This led to an industrial ripple effect. Rocket consumption surged so dramatically after the accuracy improved that naval ordnance plants boosted production by almost 30% in September alone. Production lines that had once doubted the weapon were now operating double shifts to meet the demand. What started as a 2mm correction in a single jig evolved into a nationwide manufacturing acceleration, with factories in Connecticut, Delaware, and Pennsylvania producing tens of thousands of rails and rocket bodies weekly. This detail is significant because it illustrates how industrial decisions influence battlefield outcomes. When a weapon proves effective, armies reorganize around it and industries adapt to sustain that effectiveness. It's a feedback loop. In this instance, the initial spark came from a woman who refused to overlook a crescent of carbon dust leaning in the wrong direction. Germany was unable to respond effectively. Their aircraft losses were too high, their fuel reserves were dwindling, and their production infrastructure was disintegrating under Allied bombing. By late September, their armored divisions were contending with 3 simultaneous constraints: limited mobility due to rocket fear, reduced concentration due to dispersion doctrine, and increased vulnerability due to consistent Allied aerial interdiction. During the battles along the Siegfried Line, this trio severely weakened their ability to counterattack. The war's conclusion wasn't due to rockets, but these rockets did alter the trajectory. A particular moment from the September 29th report by the 9th Air Force lingers in my mind. A staff officer noted, "The rocket is no longer an experiment, it is now a certainty." In warfare, certainty is a rare find, even more so in the realm of weapon development. Yet this certainty emerged from alignment, geometry, and a decision to trust tactile intuition over a convenient tolerance sheet. If this seems exaggerated, consider this. In the first week of October, Allied armor advanced further across the West Wall defenses than planners had anticipated for the entire month. Air power cleared the roads, rockets cleared the armor, and infantry filled the gaps. Strategy absorbed the change quietly, but thoroughly. If you believe these cascading effects are genuine, that minor industrial adjustments can lead to significant strategic outcomes, type the number 7 in the comments. If you think I'm exaggerating the precision, that war is too chaotic for one adjustment to matter, like the video instead. And if you want to see how this change influenced the broader Allied strategy, subscribe because the next chapter goes beyond rockets into the industrial logic that won the war. By the end of August 1944, the American command structure began to understand something the pilots had realized weeks earlier. The corrected rail racks were not just enhancing accuracy, they were changing the operational pace of the entire Western Front. The 9th Air Force compiled its monthly summary at 8:03 a.m. on September 1st, reporting that rocket-equipped fighter bombers had increased armored vehicle destruction by more than 200% compared to June. The numbers seemed unbelievable until analysts traced the timing backward and saw that the surge began almost exactly when the recalibrated rail shipments reached forward airfields. This is where the story expands, a tiny industrial correction leading to a tactical improvement that then cascades into a strategic shift. German units were the first to experience this. Panzerlehr, once a leading armored force in Europe, noted that moving during the day had become a death wish due to the highly accurate Allied rocket attacks. This observation is found in a surviving piece of a regimental diary dated August 27th. By early September, German military manuals were being distributed along the Western Front, advising tank commanders to operate only at dawn or dusk and to completely avoid open roads when American fighter bombers were present. This change cut their mobility by almost half, a seemingly minor